Work and recreation. Each of us who are of working age and have been working for some time have some sort of understanding of these two words. We think about them within some framework. It's very important for us to actually have very defined understandings of these two terms, actually. I think especially for us who have families, who have children especially, but even for people that are just married. Anybody whose working life directly affects other people, it's very important for how they view their concept of their work and their leisure time or their recreation. All of us have full lives, increasingly so, usually. There's so many things in our life that's distracting us and vying for our attention and our time. It's very easy to fill up our lives without really thinking about what our work and what our time away from work should look like, and how they should relate to each other, or if they should. So that's what we're going to talk about the next 15 or 20 minutes. And the first thing I want to talk about is work values. What do we think about whenever we think about work, as far as how we value it and why we're working? What are work values? Do we see work as part of the meaning to our life? Is work an expression of who we are? What does it say about us? How did we get to where we are in whatever work we're doing? And where do we see ourselves going in the future with the work we're engaged in right now? I think these are all important questions to consider when we're thinking about our own personal work values. A good place to start whenever we think about our work values, or how we value work, or how we think of the value of work, is to consider the difference between what we call a job or a career. I think a lot of people understand or think about these two terms differently. I think the general concept is kind of like whatever we do for a job is more or less kind of what we do to bring home a paycheck every day. This might have little or nothing to do with what we value personally. Whereas a career is more oriented towards what we value, what we hold to be valuable, our own personal interests, or at least we feel like it ought to be. We think of college as moving us into a career rather than just a different job. We kind of think anybody can go out and get a job, but a career is something that we purposefully intend to pursue. Corey and Corey define a job as being a position of employment within an occupation, whereas a career, the difference with a career is that it defines and pertains to one's life's work. So necessarily the value of the two are going to be different. Whereas a job is just being in an occupation to meet a specific end. A career is an expression of one's life. Very, very different values, very different understanding of the two sorts of working life. And when we think of having a job or having a career, we tend to think that a career, and especially in Corey and Corey's terminology, having a career that's an expression of one's life's work, as being fulfilling, whereas a job isn't necessarily fulfilling. One of the biggest reasons why our understanding of what work represents in our life and the importance of choosing a career that fits with our interests and values is so that we don't find ourselves in unfulfilled work. When we're engaged in work that's satisfying and fulfilling, the fruits of that work not only overflow into our productivity, but this begins to help us see how our work's connected with the rest of our lives, and how that the satisfying nature, or for that matter, the unsatisfactory nature of our work can have a direct effect in our relationships and really every aspect of the rest of our lives. Unfulfilling work can make our lives feel like drudgery and monotonous routine. It can make it where all that we live for is the idea of recreation and leisure. That the two become entirely separated. The two ideas become entirely separated whenever we see our work, hopefully not our career, but our job, or whatever work we're in, as being unfulfilling and unsatisfactory. Ideally, we ought to feel that we're called to the work that we're engaged in, as if we were created to do that work. One of my favorite authors, Os Guinness, he's an Irishman from the Guinness family, the famous Guinness family of the famous beer. But he's a Christian author and social critic, and he wrote a book called The Call, about how each of us are called to vocation, or what might be called career. He writes in his book that instead of "you are what you do," which is realistically how we normally see people, we ask them what they do, they say they're a dentist, a lawyer, or whatever else, and that frames for us their identity, and for a large part it can frame our own identity of ourselves. He writes about that instead of "you are what you do," calling, the idea of feeling called to your work, is that you do what you are. So your work, your career, is not what defines you. Rather, it's what you do to express what you are, what you value, your principles you hold to, what you want to contribute to the world by who you were created to be. It's a very different approach to what we normally think of, and this really, I think, is key to finding satisfying and fulfilling work. So that kind of moves us into the idea of how do we identify what we ought to be doing? How do we identify what Mr. Guinness would call our calling? And there's really several ways, I think, of doing this. I think personality evaluations of the sort that Corey and Corey in the textbook identify and utilize and offer up, and there's several. There's really innumerable number of ways to find different career profiles and interests. Find your interests and your personality type, your learning style, your intelligence type. All of these evaluations and tests and approaches are good ways, actually. I think they're very good and they're helpful ways to identifying, what we're good at, what kind of work we would actually be interested in doing. I think they hold a lot of value. However, as helpful as they are, I think our worldviews and the principles that we hold are really more important. I think they need to lay the foundation that our careers and our aspirations in life that are connected to the work that we do every day, our ideas of success, they all need to build upon that foundation, that worldview. That we need to start with that before we go about uncovering different sorts of careers we might want to pursue. If we compromise what ought to be the foundation, there's a good likelihood that even if we pursue what we're inclined to be interested in, or what our talents, our natural talents and gifting suggest that we would be good at, we may go into a line of work that we'll be good at, and that might be along the lines of our interests, but it might still be unfulfilling and unsatisfying. And ultimately, I believe ideally the goal and the idea of career should be to be engaged in work that is fulfilling and ultimately satisfying, for the benefit of not only ourselves but everybody that's affected by our work, right? We're going to be most productive and most beneficial to all of those affected by our work, to society in general, and especially to our family and our friends and those people that our lives affect most directly, if we're satisfied and fulfilled in the work that we're doing. So I think that's the most important part of how we think about work. And I think that actually leads into also how we think about recreation, or our leisure time. All of the time that is allowed in our lives that's not spent engaged in our employment, or our time that we spend being paid or doing work that is for somebody else's benefit. We have some interesting quotes here that Frances found. She quotes Corey, and Corey is saying, "Leisure time is free time. It's the time we control and can use for ourselves." And she also quotes this guy, Scott Walston. He says the ATUS, I'm not sure what that is, shows that the total amount of time that we spend on leisure has remained relatively constant between 2003 and 2011, so we can assume this is still rather current, at about 5 hours a day. I find that number kind of shocking, and I wonder if his definition lines up with Corey's, because it's hard to believe that we really have, that we could consider that much time of each day time that we have for free time with no obligations or no significant responsibilities. So I'm not sure that those two line up necessarily, but what I tend to find interesting about the idea of leisure and recreation, the kind of conceptualization and definition that I think we kind of hold in society generally, is that the two terms have to be, the term of work and career and leisure and recreation are more or less separate ideas, and they're really not connected at all. But I think if we're engaged in what we would call our life's work, as Corey defined career, it would seem that the entirety of our lives are going to be connected or revolve around that in some way. Only when we see leisure and recreation as an escape do we kind of separate them. So if we've come into this general feeling that work is drudgery and leisure is enjoyment, then of course we're going to separate the two. But if we go back to the idea that our careers and our vocation is calling, that we're fulfilling calling, and it's really an expression of who we are and what we value, and it's an enjoyment to be engaged in our work. If our work is satisfying and fulfilling, then it's not. It's these two ideas aren't separate, because our careers will be expressions of who we are rather than define who we are 5 days a week or however much, and then we'll do everything we can to be what we want to be in our leisure time. Rather we're the same all the time if we approach it from that way, and we might be earning money some of the time and pursuing other things in our time when we're not doing that, but ultimately we're always at work in a sense. Being a Christian, I think of this from the perspective of we are always working for the kingdom of Christ, right? We're always working for the sake of the gospel. So no matter what we're engaged in, our goal is the same, and our purpose is the same, and the reason why we're doing what we're doing, whatever it is always the same, right? This is our primary work. Our primary work is to do the work of God, to express His love in what we do, and be really ambassadors for God, workers for God, and to spread goodness and to be a force of good in the world. And we're all meant to do that in different ways. And I think especially in the careers that we pursue, that's where we should start, right? That's where we should kind of step into that pursuit from that perspective, and keep that in mind as we're led in to find out what our interests are, what we might gravitate towards career-wise from our interests, our gift, our intellectual ability, our learning style. All of that should relate to our primary work. And I think this naturally, when we think of it this way, it naturally creates kind of a countercultural understanding of what leisure and recreation means. So no longer is any aspect of our lives separate from the other, but it all flows out from the same for the same purpose, for the same goal. It's all interrelated. So we don't ever just make space and time for ourselves. We never are looking for escape. Rather, we might be engaged in different activities, or different conversations, or different contexts, but we're always engaged in the same type of work, you might say. So I'd like to end with something St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, succinctly kind of said to express this reality. He said, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God." By seeing career as calling and by understanding work itself as a means of fulfillment and pleasure, the line between work and leisure or work and recreation is much less defined. By enjoying God and finding our pleasure in serving Him, our work can be our greatest reward. And all of our life and all of our time can be free from the sort of imprisonment or difficulty of that our careers can feel like, or our jobs can feel like they are. When we're doing what we feel like we're called to do, all of life can be fulfilling work, and all of our work can feel like recreation, or what recreation actually represents is recreation. And if we're always engaged in that work of recreation, all of life will feel like it's enjoyable. Thank you.